President Trump's trade battle with Canada is taking hold on U.S. alcohol suppliers. Last week, Canada imposed a 25% tariff on several U.S. products, including wine.
Ontario's Doug Ford, who is threatening to purge the province's liquor stores of American products. So is British Columbia's David Eby, also suggesting a stop buying America approach.
Our decision not to purchase American alcohol would definitely send a message. It is one of the things that can be on the table to respond to these tariffs. And we have trade agreements with the Americans that we have to treat their products like our own.
$1 billion market didn't shrink. It vanished almost overnight. And now Washington is beginning to understand that this wasn't a short-term trade clash, but something far more disruptive that is quietly reshaping an entire industry across North America. Behind the headlines about tariffs and political rhetoric, a much more strategic shift has been unfolding. Because Canada didn't respond with a simple countermeasure. It removed American alcohol from store shelves across much of the country, cutting off access to a market worth hundreds of millions of dollars each year and forcing U.S. producers into a position where even a 25% tariff suddenly seems like the smaller issue. This situation did not start as a coordinated nationwide ban. And that detail matters because it began as a reaction to U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to impose a blanket 25% tariff on most Canadian imports in early 2025, a move that triggered a chain reaction at a provincial level rather than a single federal response. Ontario acted first, and it acted decisively because Premier Doug Ford had already warned in January 2025 during a speech to the Rural Ontario Municipal Association that if tariffs became reality, American alcohol would be removed from LCBO shelves. And once those tariffs were implemented, that warning turned into policy almost immediately. The scale of that decision was enormous, since the LCBO alone reported up to $965 million in annual sales tied to U.S. wine, beer, spirits, and seltzers, with more than 3,600 individual products sourced from 35 different U.S. states. All of them were removed in one sweeping action that effectively erased American presence from one of the largest alcohol retail systems in North America. At the same time, British Columbia began pulling what officials described as red state American alcohol brands from its government-run stores. Within days, shelves that once carried globally recognized names like Jack Daniels were left empty or replaced with messaging encouraging consumers to buy Canadian products instead, turning a trade response into a visible consumer movement. This wasn't limited to just two provinces either, because as of April 2026, restrictions on U.S.-made spirits remain in place across Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia, Atlantic Canada, and even the Territories. That means most of Canada's population now lives in regions where American alcohol is effectively unavailable through official retail channels, even though Alberta and Saskatchewan have since lifted their bans. From Washington's perspective, this quickly escalated into something far larger than a provincial issue. That is why the U.S. Trade Representative's annual report in late March 2026 formally labeled these liquor board restrictions as market access barriers that significantly restrict American exports, while directly calling for their removal during ongoing trade talks. The language in that report was direct, framing the situation as an unfair trade practice rather than a temporary reaction. That tone has also been echoed by U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra, who linked the alcohol ban alongside declining Canadian tourism to the United States as evidence of what he described as increasingly strained relations, even repeating President Trump's characterization of Canada as difficult to deal with. What makes the situation even more complicated is that the alcohol ban is now tied directly to the future of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer listing the removal of these restrictions as a condition for extending the deal. This effectively turns what began as provincial response into a high-stakes negotiation point that could influence the structure of North American trade. Ontario, however, has not stepped back, and its position has remained firm despite mounting pressure, because Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy has made it clear that American alcohol will not return to LCBO shelves until U.S. tariffs are fully removed. This reinforces a stance that Premier Doug Ford openly described as effective, even calling an irritant that is capturing Washington's attention. That choice of words reveals the strategy behind the move, which is not just retaliation but the creation of enough economic and political pressure to force a response from the United States. Ford made that clear when he said there is a simple solution available: remove the tariffs and the ban disappears. Yet while the political messaging continues on both sides, something much more significant has been unfolding within Canada's domestic alcohol market, and this is a part that Washington's reports do not fully capture. Because the empty shelf space left by American brands has not remained empty for long. Canadian producers have stepped in, and they are not just filling the gap but expanding at a pace that suggests the shift may not be temporary. Once supply chains, retail relationships, and consumer habits change at this scale, reversing them becomes far more difficult than policymakers often expect. Maverick Distillery in Oakville, Ontario, provides one of the clearest examples of this transformation. The craft distillery, founded in 2009 as the province's first licensed operation, has seen business surge dramatically since the ban took effect, with vodka sales doubling in the LCBO and whiskey sales rising by an even more striking 300%. That level of growth is not gradual. It is rapid and significant. According to CEO Craig Peters, it reflects a broader change in consumer behavior where the push to buy Canadian products has moved beyond messaging and into real purchasing decisions that are reshaping the industry from the ground up. The company is now preparing to expand into a larger facility while employing 25 people in production and actively hiring more staff, highlighting how quickly this policy has translated into tangible economic activity at the local level, something traditional tariff discussions often overlook. At the same time, Maverick has taken a strategic approach by targeting the gaps left by American brands, especially bourbon, one of the most recognizable and in-demand categories. Using barrels of Kentucky bourbon already in its inventory, the distillery developed a hybrid product blending Canadian whiskey with Kentucky bourbon, creating a spirit bottled entirely in Oakville that appeals to consumers seeking a richer bourbon-style experience without buying a fully American product. This move reflects a deeper market shift because it shows how Canadian producers are not only replacing U.S. goods but adapting them and positioning themselves to retain customers even if restrictions are eventually lifted. That raises an important question about whether American brands will be able to recover their previous market share once they return. Maverick is not alone in this expansion. Across the country, similar stories are emerging from both large and small producers, seeing consistent growth tied directly to the absence of American competition. This signals that the trend is not isolated but part of a broader transformation that is still developing. One telling example comes from Odd Society Spirits in Vancouver, where a small batch distillery introduced a strawberry gin made with fruit from British Columbia's Fraser Valley, fully embracing the growing by Canadian mindset that has shifted from a slogan into a real purchasing habit influencing production decisions. The numbers coming out of Ontario reinforce how deep this shift has become. The LCBO's Beverage Trend Report from December 2025 showed that VQA wine sales rose by 58% in a single year, while overall sales of provincially produced alcohol increased by 20%. These figures point to a structural change in consumer behavior rather than a temporary reaction to missing products. Momentum like this tends to build, because once consumers find alternatives and retailers adjust supply chains, original products rarely return to their previous dominance even after restrictions are lifted. This is why the situation has become far more serious for American producers than a typical tariff dispute. For companies like Brown-Forman, the maker of Jack Daniels, the impact has been immediate and visible. CEO Lawson Whiting described Canada's decision to remove U.S. alcohol from shelves as worse than a tariff, explaining that while a 25% tariff raises costs and still allows sales, complete removal eliminates access entirely, cutting off revenue from a market that once generated nearly $1 billion annually in Ontario alone. That distinction highlights a core issue in this conflict. Tariffs operate within a trade system where goods continue to move. What Canada has done in several provinces removes that system entirely, replacing it with a controlled market where access is determined at the government level rather than through pricing or competition. This level of control allowed provinces to send a direct message to American suppliers. According to a letter obtained through a Freedom of Information request, those suppliers were told that their access to one of North America's largest alcohol markets now depends on the removal of U.S. tariffs, even encouraging them to communicate the impact to members of Congress, effectively turning private companies into indirect participants in the political process. This is where the situation becomes even more complex, because the timeline for resolution is now tied to the upcoming review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement scheduled for July 1st, 2026, and both sides have set conditions that do not align. The United States want provincial alcohol bans lifted as part of extending the agreement, while Canadian provinces insist the bans will remain until tariffs are removed. Because both sides treat these as prerequisites rather than outcomes, neither has an immediate incentive to move first, creating a stalemate that could reshape trade relations across multiple industries. Those industries are already feeling pressure beyond alcohol. The same tariff environment is affecting sectors like steel and aluminum, where a 50% U.S. tariff has disrupted export flows that once sent roughly half of Canadian steel and nearly 90% of its aluminum south of the border, leading to layoffs among the 23,000 steel workers and 10,000 in aluminum. These figures show how quickly policy decisions translate into real economic consequences. The automotive sector faces even greater risk. In 2024, more than 90% of Canadian-made vehicles were exported to the United States, many benefiting from tariff-free access under existing agreements. That advantage now faces uncertainty as companies begin adjusting production strategies ahead of potential changes. Signs of this shift are already visible, with automakers not waiting for negotiations to conclude before acting. Plant closures in Brampton and Ingersoll, along with shift reductions in Oshawa, signal a broader movement of investment toward the United States, where companies can avoid tariffs and operate under more predictable conditions. This shift threatens a domestic industry employing 125,000 workers directly and supporting many more through supply chains, raising the stakes far beyond a single product category. The debate over how to respond has become more direct, with growing calls for Canada to move beyond defensive measures and adopt a more aggressive stance by introducing reciprocal tariffs on U.S. imports, including vehicles, to level the playing field and protect domestic industries from long-term decline. The longer the situation continues, the more entrenched these changes become. Canadian producers are expanding capacity, hiring workers, and developing new products, while American companies are losing shelf space, distribution networks, and consumer familiarity in regions that once provided stable revenue. This creates a scenario where even a full resolution may not restore the previous balance. And that leads to a much larger question than tariffs alone. If one country can effectively remove another's products from its market and replace them with domestic alternatives at this scale, then the concept of market access begins to look very different than it did just a few years ago. So could this be the moment that fundamentally reshapes how trade operates between the United States and Canada? If you found this breakdown useful and want more deep dives like this, consider subscribing and staying tuned, because the coming months could determine the future of North American trade, and the outcome may not look anything like what most expect today.